Not too long ago, I had an opportunity to hear an interview with a guy that was an expert in crowd dynamics. There had been a concert, I can't remember where it was, I think it was in Texas, and some people died because the crowd got out of control. And this guy had spent a career managing these sorts of things, and his basic point was somebody there should have been paying attention to the density of the crowd, because crowds, when they get packed in enough, begin to act like waves. You think about a wave in the ocean, it's actually energy that's carrying that water along and it keeps moving. And if you put enough people in a crowd and somebody pushes on the edge of that crowd, it moves like a wave until that wave hits a stage or a wall. And that energy doesn't have anywhere to go but into human bodies at that point, and that's where people begin to get crushed and they can't breathe, right? We need room to breathe. And so his point was, somebody should always have a job at something, especially if you know the crowd is going to be big, to just stop, right? Turn off the music, turn on the lights, stop everything so that the wave stops moving and people can ease up and give everyone some room to breathe so that people literally can get suffocated. Because we need air as human beings. A single mom reaches over to the bedside before dawn to grab her phone and see just how early it is. She can't sleep anyway, so she decides to get up. Her 8-year-old shares this little tiny bedroom with her in their little tiny apartment. And she knows that if she can get up now and sneak out into the kitchen, she will have some moments of peace. So she gets some coffee made, and as she sits down, she notices that the pile of bills on the edge of the counter is still the same size that it was, and she's not quite sure how that pile of bills is going to get reduced. Then she sees the backpack there and says, yep, I got to get that 8-year-old off to school today. And she hopes deeply that today is a day that they won't call again for her to have to come and deal with the next thing. Because if she has to leave work again, she may not be able to keep that job. As she sits there, she's deeply looking for just some room to breathe as a parent, as a human being, and even beyond that, some deeper transformation of her circumstances. She also knows at the end of that day, she'll get off of work, go pick her child up from aftercare, and they're going to have to go to the grocery store, which she hates because she knows that there's going to be people watching them and judging them. There's going to be people looking down their noses at them, people who have no idea what challenges this child has, no idea all the work that she has put in trying to help this child thrive and do better, and yet they're going to be experts in everything and offer those judgments, including the one person who once said, I think your child is possessed. Kid wakes up, they make it through their morning routine relatively smoothly on this particular day, and as they head outside, there's a crowd of people. That's unusual. So she says, hey, where are you all going? And they said, we're going down to the lake. Jesus is down there. And she's heard about Jesus, about what he was doing all over Galilee, bringing healings and teaching and visiting synagogues. And she, in that moment, thinks maybe he can help. And so she follows the crowd down to the lake, and they get down to the lake, and it's crowded. So crowded the people are starting to get into that thing where they're making a wave, and she picks the kid up because she doesn't want the kid to get crushed, and she can barely see Jesus, and he's not healing anybody yet or talking yet because the wave of people is pushing him into the waves of the lake. Jesus is nearly crowded out without any room to breathe on his own, and she is beginning to lose hope that she's going to be able to encounter Jesus as she goes along. But it's at that moment that Jesus looks over and sees a boat. He goes and hops in the boat and asks them to put it out in the water a little bit so that he can get some breathing room, so that he can do the teaching that he came to do. And he does it. Now, on that day where she came, maybe hoping deeply for some transformation for her child, hoping that Jesus might, lay hands on that child and cast out that demon or bring whatever that healing is, that didn't happen. But she did get to hear this teaching. And that teaching of Jesus gave her hope and gave her just enough room to breathe to get through that day. And maybe that just enough room to breathe became transformative. She came looking for something that day, and all of us as people come looking for Jesus when we're in a place like this for a variety of reasons. For some, it's like for her, a deep need of healing and transformation. For others, it's comfort amidst grief. For others, it's a challenge. We know that maybe something's not quite right, and we feel like we need to be pushed into some new directions, and we hope that maybe Jesus can do that. For others, maybe it's a search for meaning or purpose. There's all manner of things we come into this place looking for as we seek to encounter Jesus. And just like happened on the beach at the lake that day, often Jesus gets nearly crowded out to where we can't hear Jesus because there's so much other crowd and noise around us. And that also, right? Each of our searching may be different, and the things that can crowd Jesus out may also be different. For some, it's how long that to-do list is. And when you're in bed, the to-do list is still going, and you've got to get up and add things to it, and it just keeps going and going, and that can make it hard to encounter Jesus, right? It's crowding Jesus out. For others of us, it's not the length of the to-do list, but the pace. The thing after thing after thing that we have to be doing that makes it hard to encounter Jesus because he's nearly crowded out. For some, it might be that list of worries that are constantly spinning in your head. Worries about health, worries about finances, worries about friends, family, all of that. And when we're all filled up with those worries, it's hard, right? Because we can nearly crowd Jesus out. And there's all manner of other anxieties and things in our life, including the messages we get bombarded with every day by our culture that tell us we should change ourselves to be more beautiful or whatever it is that it's telling us to do. We should buy our way into happiness and all the other messages we get, right? Those things can nearly crowd Jesus out as well. But the thing is, in the story, Jesus doesn't get entirely crowded out, right? As that wave of people presses him into the waves of the lake, he's only nearly crowded out. It happened the previous week. Last week in our story, he was in the synagogue in Nazareth, and they all got mad at him, and they tried to push him off a cliff, right? So the crowd nearly crowded him out that day too. And then this day, today, he goes, well, look, there's a boat. So he gets himself some breathing room. But as the gospel goes on and the crowds continue to pour at Jesus like waves, eventually he gets fully crowded out because that crowd puts him right up onto the cross where he has no room to breathe. But God brings him out the other side with like resurrection air and new life, no longer crowded out, but in a new space. So that when we find ourselves searching for whatever it is we're longing and yearning for with God, and we find that Jesus is nearly crowded out, the promise we have in the resurrection is that he's, even if fully crowded out, eventually comes back again with that resurrection life for us. Now, we may not always experience that right when we want to, and there may be times where we get all the way to death, wondering where we're going to get some space to breathe before we get into that new space of resurrection. But that is the promise, that Jesus will not be crowded out and that he will continue to come to us, to give us room to breathe, and that room to be then becomes transformative. My favorite part of this story is the first word. It's my new favorite part. I hadn't noticed it before. Do you remember what the first word was? I said it like really loud and then stopped for a second. No, yeah. Once. That's it. Starts off just once. And the reason I love that is because, right, Jesus encounters the disciples in the boat. They themselves are probably looking for some room to breathe, figuratively, right? Because they didn't catch anything the night before. They didn't have a whole warehouse of fish. They weren't running a fishing empire. If they didn't catch anything, that's not good. If that's happened a few days in a row, that starts to get really bad. And so when he takes them out in the boat and they get all of this fish, that had to give them some great big sigh of, oh, okay, this is going to pay the bills for a while. I don't know what happens to the fish when they just go off and follow Jesus. I hope there were some neighbors there that said, hold on, that's their fish. Let's go take it to the market so their families can eat. We don't know, right? But that experience that they get of getting that little bit of breathing room absolutely changes their lives so that they just go follow Jesus where he's going. But the idea that the story begins with once tells me a lot of things. Last week we heard from Jeremiah's call story, where Jeremiah is told before you were even born, you were anointed as a prophet. And you can hear that and say, yes, God has a vision and for each and every one of us, right? We are beautifully and wonderfully made with gifts. But when we say that, we can get to a point where we think that God has a plan, we say sometimes, and we think of God as a chess player sort of moving people around, right? And when we think like that, it takes away the idea that we actually have free will. Because we do have free will and we can make choices. We can choose to be terrible people. We can choose to try to be good people. We can help people, not help people. All of those things we have the power to choose. God isn't moving us around and making those choices for us. So when we hear the story of Jeremiah, it sounds like Jeremiah was anointed to be a prophet from the beginning. And honestly, that's how I've always thought about the disciples. Like Jesus had a list, and he was like, all right, I got to go find Simon Peter. And then James and John, okay, they're over there. And like that they were already ordained to be the 12, and Jesus just had to go find the 12 that were already part of the plan so they could get pulled into the story. That's not how the Gospel of Luke reads today. Jesus is being pressed into the water by this crowd, and then there just happens to be a boat there. And he needs to get into that boat so that he can have some breathing room so that he can do the teaching that he came to do. And it just so happens that Simon Peter is the one who's in the boat, right? He's washing the nets, probably paying a little bit of attention to what Jesus is saying, but then goes ahead, jumps in, takes the boat out a little bit. This sounds a lot more happenstance and coincidental than it does that there's some great big plan that's unfolding where each of us gets put in our place. So that as Jesus comes to the lake that day, it maybe doesn't come looking for Simon Peter, but looking to teach. Oh, and here's this person. And when Simon Peter says, look, I am sinful. You shouldn't be doing all this for us. That might have been just the point where Jesus says, yeah, he'll do. Right? He can be one of the 12. Come follow me. And then James and John, why don't you guys come too? And the reason I love all of this is because I think this is how God works. That God shows up in our lives and works with what happens to be around to bring us the gift of life and grace that sometimes just gives us enough breathing room that we can get through that day, and that breathing room then can prove to be transformative. My doctoral research that I've been working on included 9 people who shared stories from their own lives alongside stories from the Bible. And you could really take most of their stories and follow the same pattern of the gospel today, where they could have stood up and said, once, and then talked about the struggle that was happening in their life at that point in time, and then say, and there happened to be someone there who, and then fill in the blank of how that person showed up in a graceful way that gave them some breathing room as a human. And then looking back now, they could say, gosh, that was a real big moment that has proved to be transformative in my life. All because once during a hard time, there was somebody that just happened to be there that perhaps God worked through. And that was just 9 people. But I would bet that if we took some time today and just took everybody that's here and home and said, think about a hard time in your life when you just desperately needed some room to breathe, to just pause, to just take a deep breath and collect yourself, to try to imagine how you were going to get past the next day or 2 or the diagnosis or whatever it is. And I would bet that for most of us, just then, there happened to be someone that called or dropped off some food or gave you a ride or said a kind word. Whatever it is that they did that gave you that time to just take a big breath and get on with the rest of that day in a way that gave you room that ultimately ended up changing things. Just once, right? It just takes that one time for that person to be there. The flip side of that then is sometimes we are the ones. And we probably don't always even know it, that we are the ones. That something happens and somebody's struggling and we just happen to be the ones that are there that God works through in that moment that gives them just enough room to breathe, that then some transformation happens. They experience grace and hope and faith and love in all new kinds of ways. And I would bet that often, most of the time probably, we don't know that we're part of that story that starts once and ends in a different place than it would have otherwise. As we gather today, with whatever searching we bring, we live in a world full of people that are spiritually thirsty and longing for something that's different. Some of them may be looking for Jesus, and some of them may just be looking. And there's this crowding out of Jesus that can happen, but Jesus will not ultimately be crowded out. God is going to look into those great waves and crowds of people and all of that searching and find people with that one person or two people, whoever it is that happens to be at hand, just like the boat that happened to be there. And my prayer for all of us is that we can see those stories in our own lives and maybe the way we show up in others so that we can tell those same things and share those stories to just say, once, amen.